Hello, this is Chris Browder. This is video 1.2. We're going to be talking today about the nature of languages. This lesson is based largely on Rod Ellis's book, Understanding Second Language Acquisition, Gaspani and Plonsky's book, Second Language Acquisition, an Introductory Course, and Seville Troik's book, and that's Introducing Second Language Acquisition. Well, in order to study how languages are learned, we must first have a basic understanding of what languages are and what it means to be proficient in a language. Many people use the term native-like to refer to the highest level of language proficiency. The assumption with this term is that anyone who has learned a language as a first language or as a so-called native speaker functions at the highest level. Some people take issue with this because they feel that native speakers might not be the best model for all learners to aspire to. If the model or standard is a native speaker, then one must ask which native speaker. As you know, different people use English in different ways. British English is different from American English. The English in Boston is very different from the English in Arkansas. Likewise, there are also differences in racial and ethnic groups that you would probably want to consider. Some people argue that such a thing as standard English exists, and that people who do not follow the rules of standard English are simply incorrect. Linguists, however, argue that everyone has an accent, variety, dialect, or vernacular. It's just that some people have more influence than others and can easily assert their version of the language as the standard. Whoever has the most influence basically sets the standard. So just consider the expression the king's English, as in, he speaks the king's English, or that's not the king's English. Linguists argue that people who speak different varieties are always correct by the standards of their own variety, and as we have already discussed, we each have our own variety. In this sense, native speakers are always correct, even when they're incorrect, unless, of course, they're making a mistake. Each variety or vernacular or dialect has its own set of rules, and the native speakers of those varieties, vernaculars, and dialects follow those rules perfectly. In fact, they make the rules and can even change the rules if they all agree to. So, again, when we talk about learning a second language, we need to ask whose version of the language should we be learning? Once we have chosen our model or target, we then need to ask how we will know when a person has met the standards set by that model or target. A proficient person knows a language, but what exactly does this knowledge of language consist of? To answer this question, it is necessary to introduce two terms used by linguist Noam Chomsky. Those terms are competence and performance. Competence is a person's internalized system or set of rules for a language. When a person actually uses the language, however, it is performance, not competence. A person can make a mistake with performance, but not with competence. So, when people are healthy, relaxed, focused, and sober, their language use is probably a close reflection of their competence. But when they are sick, in pain, distracted, anxious, or under the influence of drugs or alcohol, they make mistakes, and those are mistakes with their performance. So, to illustrate this, imagine that a friend of yours has had too much to drink and is now slurring her speech. The slurring is a mistake and temporary. It is a problem with performance, but her competence is unchanged. She knows how to speak correctly, she's just drunk. So, now that we have introduced this idea of competence, as an internal and somewhat stable language system or set of rules inside a native speaker, we need to ask what competence consists of. Normally, if someone follows rules, we assume they know what those rules are. But with language, this is not often the case. So, take, for example, a 7-year-old who says, I want to have some of the candy that the little girl is eating. In this example, the child has formed a very complex sentence with a relative clause, but it is very doubtful that this child can tell you what the rules for forming relative clauses are. Now, imagine if you're asking a 7-year-old to tell you what the rules for relative clauses are, and she says, are you referring to restrictive or non restrictive relative clauses? You must consider first whether it is a subject clause, object clause, or whether it is a clause that is the object of a preposition. And I think that's kind of unlikely. Most adults even cannot tell you the rules they're applying, but somehow manage to apply them correctly. For instance, we can somehow feel that it is not right to say, I lost my book that he gave me. We would instead prefer to hear, I lost the book that he gave me. When asked why one is better, we just say it feels better. Most of us cannot really tell you that the article the should be used instead of the possessive pronoun because the relative clause makes the book definite and specific in this sentence. In fact, many adults cannot even tell you what a pronoun is. So, in summary, people generally don't know the rules of their language but still follow those rules somehow. To explain this, some linguists have argued that language proficiency, or competence, as Chomsky calls it, consists largely of implicit, unconscious, or possibly even innately governed rules. This kind of knowledge can be referred to as explicit knowledge of language. Implicit knowledge of language. Implicit knowledge is best understood in contrast to explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is the rules we know, and we can verbalize those rules. You could say we're very aware of those rules, and we can teach those rules to others. When we go to school, English teachers often teach us these rules. Interestingly, many of the language rules we learn in school are not the rules we actually follow when we're speaking. For instance, we all know that we're not supposed to use a preposition to end a sentence with, but I just did, and it felt really good. But what if I had said we're not supposed to use with a preposition to end a sentence? That sentence would have made you a little confused, I think. Every 7-year-old native speaker knows that it is wrong to put the preposition there, but children cannot tell you why it is wrong because they only know the rules implicitly. At this moment, there may easily be over 1 billion people trying to learn English as a foreign language. Many of them are in language classes studying grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary translations. That's all explicit knowledge. Many people find that this explicit knowledge is useful for passing a test, but doesn't seem to be helping much when they are actually trying to communicate with somebody in that second language. For this reason, people on SLA have given us the term communicative competence. This refers specifically to the ability to communicate in the language. The idea of communicative competence seems simple at first, but it is not. When we talk about communicative competence, not only do we need to ask who you want to communicate with, but we also need to ask how and why. SLA researcher Jim Cummins distinguishes two kinds of communicative competence for this reason. The first kind is basic interpersonal communicative skills, or BICS. The second kind is cognitive academic language proficiency, or CALP. The BICS are the skills we use when socializing. People need that language skill to make friends and get around in daily life. CALP, on the other hand, includes the academic language skills we use for studying in school. CALP includes very specific academic vocabulary and many very complex grammar structures. It is important to note that some language learners successfully learn BICS without learning CALP and vice versa. When a student learns BICS without CALP, people often assume he is proficient in English but doesn't do the work because he's lazy. Likewise, if a student learns CALP without BICS, people might think he is shy or even antisocial or a geek or a nerd or just poorly adjusted or rude. Similar to the idea of CALP is the idea of English for specific purposes. A second language learner can become very fluent in the language of one field without gaining fluency in another. So, for example, I met a man a long time ago in South Korea, and he was an engineer. He could read complex engineering journals and instructions in English that I couldn't understand, but he struggled painfully with even the most basic conversational English. So you really need to ask why you're learning English. What exactly are you going to use that English for? Because the English that each person uses is very different. A word can have one meaning in one profession and a very different meaning in a different profession. Similarly, there are four domains in English: speaking, reading, writing, and listening. Learners can become very skilled in one domain without gaining skills in another. I've met students who could speak English like native speakers, but whose writing was beginner level. I myself have achieved an intermediate level in speaking, listening, and reading in Korean, but my Korean writing is at the novice level. It's kind of like a preschooler or a kindergartner, maybe. Besides the four domains, there are also differences in lexicon, phonology, syntax, morphology, discourse, pragmatics. Some SLA researchers have argued that lexicon, for example, which is vocabulary learning, is the driving force behind language acquisition. They claim that we can learn a language mostly by focusing on learning its vocabulary. And this is largely true because most people can understand a language learner when he is stringing words together, even if he is getting the grammar very wrong. In fact, we can communicate a lot with one word sentences. Lexicon is also essential to reading in a second language, especially academic reading. But phonology is very important. If we use a word but cannot pronounce it well, then people will not understand us. Sadly, we must also consider that many native speakers place too much value on pronunciation. When a second language learner has native like pronunciation, the listener will often assume the learner has fully mastered the language. This is actually a problem for young children learning English as a second language because they do so well with pronunciation. People might think they no longer need ESL services and accommodations just simply because they have good pronunciation and they talk like all the other kids do. Likewise, if a person has problems with pronunciation, then other people may assume he doesn't know English and needs to study more. And this is a huge problem for adults, since adults generally struggle to learn correct pronunciation in a second language and often just simply cannot get the so called correct pronunciation. These adults can be very, very proficient, but due to pronunciation issues, they get treated like they don't know English. And this is a form of discrimination. Last but not least, there is this issue of pragmatics. Pragmatics is the set of rules that governs how context influences how we use and interpret language. Second language learners can master the lexicon, syntax, morphology, and phonology of a language, but will experience terrible misunderstandings without a mastery of pragmatics. For instance, in a restaurant, it is common for a waiter to make a recommendation to you, like saying something like, "Can I recommend you try the oysters today? They are very fresh." But what if that waiter said, "You choose oysters"? Someone might think the waiter is very rude. In another example, a person walking down a crowded hall might say, "Excuse me, please." What if that person instead said, "Get out of my way"? So, I hope this presentation helped you to begin to understand the nature of second language acquisition and how complex language can really be. All right, thank you very much.